that shall not be named. Neither storm nor flood will stop us as we continue to be going strong here. We're glad to hear that everybody is safe, that everybody is really doing well, and that even Flossie got to go out of town, which is great. And I hope everybody else. So we're going to wait a second. This one on YouTube, as I'm on two places. I always forget the YouTube code word, so I can't put it on at my house, so I got to do it somewhere else. See if I can get my host back.
Gail, anytime you want to join us at services on Saturday, just let us know.
That's right.
Talking to me?
The what?
Talking to me?
Yeah, I said anytime you want to go to a Saturday service, just give us a call.
Yeah, Gail came. It was great. David skipped services yet again. You know, they do have flights.
Soon.
They have
I'll be
flights
there
from
soon.
London to Savannah. You just have to go to like New York, Chicago, LA, and then come to Savannah
Well,
through
there always
Houston.
seems to be a weather problem
Yeah.
somewhere. It's
We do have, which is funny because London has a reputation of being a little bit wetter, but Savannah has definitely had a lot
it's
of
a
wet.
bit cloudy, but usually when it's raining, it's just a mist.
Yeah.
We're rarely stopped by flooding.
But it's also great for those Sherlock Holmes movies.
Hmm.
And yes, we will have, I think it's supposed to rain here for another 7 to 8 straight days, I think, right? So be safe, everybody. Welcome, Genevieve. Welcome to Ron and Arlene, and to Michael and David and Gail, and to Jeff, and to everybody watching on YouTube, especially Arnold. We know we got a couple people doing that. And to everybody traveling. We're here to talk again about anti-Semitism. We're just going through a little bit of the history, and some of the word usages are a little different, but we talked about anti-Semitism and how what we call modern anti-Semitism probably started about 1,000 years ago with the Jews killed Christ routine, which of course is ironic because the Christ had died 1,000 years earlier. So there was a long waiting period, incubation period before they started really going after us. The beginning of the Crusades might be considered the start. You have the blood libel 50 years later. And then of course you've got the expulsion from England and France, and the limitations on what Jews could do in terms of professions, limiting them to certain professions, which gave way to the stereotype of the greedy Jew, the money-hungry Jew. And then we come into the 19th century, and the world is changing. We have Darwin, especially. We have scholars in both the Jewish world and Christian world starting to look at the Bible from a different perspective. The documentary Hypothesis, where perhaps the Bible had written by human beings at different times and then edited, started to become popular. The Industrial Revolution is in sway. And I think a lot of people felt, certainly the positive people, the glasses half full people, thought that science was going to be a way to destroy a lot of the negative aspects of society, the inequality, the hate. And obviously they were wrong. Science in some ways helped out, but of course people used science in different ways. And as the world became a little less religious, the anti-Semitism still stayed a little bit, we killed Christ, but it moved into more of a biological anti-Semitism, really starting in Germany and Europe in the 1880s, 1890s, where Jews were biologically inferior. And we were cast into groups with others, homosexuals, African Americans, women, the inferred, those with some sort of mental disability that we would call back then. And so all of these charts started to really try and define Jew as a different species even, or different race. And so inferior was the new Jews killed Christ, although the Jews killed Christ was still around. And this anti-Semitism really hit hard with the Dreyfus Affair, which we'll probably talk about next week. I was going to talk about this week, but I think we'll do it next week. We can get to the modern anti-Semitism, the Dreyfus Affair, which became one of the most important issues in France's history, certainly its modern history, in many ways defined France for the 19th and the 20th and 21st century, centered unfortunately around a Jewish man who just happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time and be Jewish. And so the Dreyfus Affair, of course, led to what we talk about a lot is the foundation of Israel and Zionism, but it really created a division in France. One side wanted to be a little bit more totalitarian. The other side, a little bit more democratic. Obviously, the democratic side eventually won. But the scars continued as this anti-Semitism really widened because of the Dreyfus Affair and other issues. Because even if you had been a Dreyfusonian, that didn't mean you couldn't be anti-Semitic. Even if you supported the idea that France should be more democratic, you still could be anti-Semitic and look at Jews as a cause of all of these issues. The protocols of Zion, of course, were still around, and they became major issues in the Jewish world. The Jews controlled the banking industry, and a lot had to do with some sort of inferiority complex that were biologically created to make us greedy. Instead of we were greedy price killers, we're greedy because we're biologically inferior. So it was a combination, but obviously this viewpoint manifested itself most prominently in the 1920s and then unfortunately 1930s and 40s, where Nazi Germany really used this science going back to the 1880s to prove that Jews were inferior. Now, they didn't just go after Jews. Obviously, they went after the same groups. You were gay, not as much as women. And certainly women had restrictions, but not, but African Americans, the infirmed, handicapped, you know, what we call the Romana, obviously. So there were others, but the Jews, our people, really became the focus of this hatred and this anti-Semitism that was less religious. The Nazis, they weren't really centering their viewpoint on Jews killed Christ. Certainly probably was in there, but really what you saw more often were Jews were inherently not only inferior, but some sort of infestation. That's this inferiority, this biological problem that we had really created havoc for society. And so they took this idea to the nth degree that probably we've never seen before in human history, and decided that the way to solve the problem was to, of course, exterminate the Jewish problem. And so that really took hold. Now we talk about the Nazis, but again, we saw this idea throughout Europe. Even people who weren't Nazis supported that idea. Even the Poles who were attacked by, you know, viciously attacked, and the Polish were also on this scale of inferiority. So when Germany took over Poland, Germany did not like Poles. The Nazis did not like the Poles, but the Poles still did not like the Jews who were at a lower level on this. It's almost like, yes, we know the Germans hate us, but you're still worse than us. It was kind of that kind of, I don't mind to be low on the totem pole as long as I'm ahead of you. And so even though the Poles were really dealt with harshly by the Nazis, they still dealt harshly with the Jewish community. We saw a high percentage of Poles really turning in Jews. Unfortunately, there were those who obviously risked their lives or who kind of stayed inside. But so this anti-Semitism really pervaded through much of Europe and around the world. We already knew it was starting to go into the Muslim world. And that really started in the 1920s, in the 19 teens, with the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. But this anti-Semitism that Jews were inferior kind of went farther in many respects than the Christ-killing Jews. So the Christ-killing Jews is really just a Christian anti-Semitism. It does not, I mean, nobody in India or China or in the Muslim world really speaks about Jews as Christ killers, obviously. And there was really no anti-Semitism in the Muslim world until probably the 20th century. Now, Jews were, as we mentioned, in inferior status. And at times we were persecuted, but it was really in the Muslim world a anti-anybody but the Muslims. And in some cases, often Jews were treated better than everybody else. And we have to remember that really goes all the way to the late 19th and 20th century. So in the Muslim world, this reputation that we've at each other's throats for 1,500 years is completely wrong. Absolutely, as we mentioned last week. So even into the 19th century, where there were problems sometimes with the Muslim world for Jews, I don't think it was really because of this anti-Semitism. It was Jews were second citizens, usually considered better than anybody else. But if you're the only second-class citizen in a country, but a lot of, the Jews in most places we think that were treated harshly, Iraq, Iran, Yemen, North Africa, really that's the 20th century. That's the side effect of the creation of the state of Israel. But this biological inferiority really does take hold in the Muslim world a bit too, along with the prodigals of Zion, during World War I, where you start seeing Jews starting to settle more in Israel. You see some vehement anti-Semitism coming from certain groups. And you also see the competition during and after World War I to see who's going to take control of certain areas in the Middle East. The Jewish community wanted to have areas of what is now Israel. Various Muslim communities wanted to have control of areas. So there was that type of competition that led eventually to the anti-Semitism. But really, this biological anti-Semitism reached its height in the German world and in Europe. And obviously, it does fester in America even. We know America went to war and won with the war, obviously, with America and England. But before America went into this war in the 1930s, this German propaganda where Jews were inferior was already spreading through America, especially in areas where there were lots of Jews in New York and places like that. We saw rallies at places like, what's that big place in New York? I always forget the most famous rally. What's that big stadium? Not stadium, where they used to have boxing and
Madison Square Garden.
Madison Square Garden. Yeah, thank you. So even at Madison Square Garden, there were major rallies against the Jewish community led by these American Jews and Germans coming over. And there was a lot of people who supported the Germans against the Jews in America in the 1930s. It's the Depression. Germany is financially finding ways to better itself, apparently by prosecuting the Jewish community. Germany came out of the Depression with the Nazis faster than most countries because of what they were doing, this harsh treatment of others. And there was a lot of support for them in America. And you can go online and see it wasn't just Germans coming over from Germany again, it was Americans of German ancestry who were also really putting this point forward. And I think even some thought that we might support Germany in this war. which is a scary thought since in the 30s. Obviously, it was not a thought of the president or the higher ups, but certainly some of the population.
Thank you, Charles
Obvi-
Lindbergh.
Yeah, Charles Lindbergh, obviously. I mean, there were some major anti-Semites. Lindbergh and Ford were the two most prominent. But there were a lot of others as well. And again, this is not everywhere. I mean, you do not see this kind of biological hatred in the South very much. There was not a lot of Jews, and the Jews were generally supported by the Southern communities. But of course, this all changes with the attack on Pearl Harbor. We had already been supporting Britain financially. But once we go to war, this changes in America completely in many respects and around the world. And especially after the war, when we see the horrors of the Holocaust, even though there are Holocaust deniers, we know. But after what we see, this idea of classifying Jews as biologically inferior ends almost completely very quickly. I mean, the idea that peoples are inherently inferior, not just Jews, but any other peoples, becomes associated with the Nazis. And nobody wants to be associated with the Nazis, not after they lose the war, not after what we see they did. I mean, there's 60 million people dead, hundreds of millions of people injured. Europe is in shambles. And nobody wants to be associated with the Nazis. So there's always going to be these neo-Nazis, crazies, but they don't really take hold of countries or the vernacular. It's almost against the rules to start putting out this idea that Jews are inferior biologically. Now, in modern times, it's come back. There's so much media going out there, but you don't see countries or mass populations putting forth these ideas anymore, because if you say Jews are biologically inferior, you're saying the same thing about Poles and African Americans and women and gays, and the list goes on and on. You can say it about Chinese and the Indians, and you can say it about the Japanese. So that kind of anti-Semitism ends really quickly. It's like a knife just cuts it off because it's associated with the Nazis. The Nazis lose. They are rightly so considered the worst individuals by many in human history. And nobody wants to overtly be connected to them, except for these fringe groups, sometimes that make their way to the center, but most of the times remain on the fringe, thank goodness. And so you don't see, for instance, on college campuses, anti-Semitism with these college professors saying that Jews are biologically inferior. You don't see scientists saying that as they did in the 1880s through the 1940s. It's just not done. If you're a professor on a campus of any university at a respectable university, and you say scientifically Jews are inferior, you're going to lose your job, or you're going to create such a ruckus that it's going to be a mess for the university. You don't see people saying that about anybody. It's just not done. Not because some people probably don't want to, it's just because it has become something that is not allowed to be said. And we've seen this now for 80 years. Now, does that mean anti-Semitism ended? No, absolutely not. And as we've seen, anti-Semitism is an ever evolving entity. It's not one person who does it, somehow it just happens. And so the new anti-Semitism takes a little bit longer to really come into focus. And that's because the world has seen what happened to the Jews, and there's a lot of support for the Jewish community or a lot of pity. Not necessarily in the Muslim world because of what's going on in the Middle East, but certainly in the rest of the world. And so we really are given almost a pass for a while. There are those who blame the war on Jews, obviously, but that's not coming from leaders of countries or universities. That's still on the fringes. But this next anti-Semitism is what we see today. And it is the exact same thing as anti-Semitism. Genevieve, did you have a question?
I was just gonna say, just in the few years that I've tried to convert, they don't come out and directly say it, but I've noticed just when I start telling people that I've studied Judaism, they make these like little sarcastic remarks, or even be like, "That's satanic," and I'm like, "Wait a minute, how is that satanic?"
Yeah, and that's what we see. We see Ron.
Yeah, Genevieve, that's interesting. I hope it's not anyone in our congregation because we're very welcoming.
Oh no, it's Christians. It's like my family and stuff. When I finally came out and told my family or my Christian communities or other communities that I was studying Judaism instead of Christianity, they wouldn't come out and say it directly, but they would make little like jabs or remarks or like these condescending remarks, if that makes sense. And then one person the other day tried to say that I'm satanic, and I'm like, that's not how that works.
Yeah, and I think what we see some of that going around. I mean, the anti-Semitism is still there after World War II. It's kind of simmering, but it hasn't really, it's almost like it hasn't found itself. I mean, the foundations of this new anti-Semitism starts in 1948 with the creation of the State of Israel. There is a lot of support at this point. Obviously, the UN voted on the partition. But what we'll see is this anti-Semitism starts to form as you see a lot of hate spewed out from the Muslim world about Jews in Israel. Now, you're not seeing this in the mainstream in the rest of the world because for the rest of the world, remember, technology, the news is not what it is today. So in the 1950s and early 60s, Israel is this far off place. Muslims are these far off people. And there's only a couple of news sources. But this is where you're going to see the foundations of this anti-Semitism. In the Muslim world, Israel becomes the symbol of the Western might. And the hatred for the West starts to be fomented in the 50s, 60s, all the way to this day. And Israel is a center point because it's the only Western country in the area. Now, in the 50s and early 60s, it's not really becoming a massive American issue or a European issue. You still have some of the old anti-Semitism, the Jews kill Christ, the stereotypes, but you don't see it as much in open air. It's more about the gentleman's agreements. Jews are restricted in these professions, in these areas, in these universities, and most Jews are fine with it. I mean, nobody wants to rock the boat. But in the 60s, that really starts to change. You start seeing American Jews less satisfied with the gentleman's agreement. You see American Jews protesting the war, Vietnam. You see American Jews front and center in civil rights. You see Europe starting to get past this World War II hangover. And in 1967, you see something that helps to change everything, and that is the Six-Day War. Now, up until the Six-Day War, Israel had been considered a fine army for the area, but the Muslims' armies were considered so inferior that it was not a big deal that Israel could hold them off. And that changes in 1967. The Six-Day War, in which Israel decimates every country near it that wants to go to war with it in 6 days, completely destroys every air force. If they wanted, they could have taken control of Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, Egypt, probably Iran and Iraq as well. Probably, so, I mean, they could have just gone anywhere they wanted. They were so much stronger. And that, in many ways, became a rallying cry for anti-Semites. because now we have a clearer vision of what Israel is. It is the bad guy. And in 1967, Israel, not because they wanted, but because they felt they needed to, end up with the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, along with the Sinai and Golan Heights. And the people there are treated terribly by Muslims. I mean, the people in the Gaza and in the West Bank were treated horribly by the Egyptians and the Jordanians, much worse than Israel, way worse. But it's one thing to abuse your own people, it's another for others to be seen. And in the Muslim world, they don't get along with each other, but they're very much we're still Muslim. And Muslims are superior in that world. And Jews had taken advantage of that to be second-class citizens for millennia. But at this point, it's not just about Jews being second-class citizens, it's about them having a powerful country nearby. And so the anti-Israel, now, when we say anti-Israel, they're not really stressing Gaza and the West Bank yet in the 60s and 70s, because those areas were not what you would say coming out in the media as much as later. But you are seeing that this is a strong country that's presenting a problem for the Muslim world, and they are now spewing nonstop anti-Semitism. But it's not anti-Semitism because they're saying it's anti-Israel. And anti-Israel becomes the new anti-Semitism. And it still is here today. So in the 70s, again, it's just nonstop spewing of Israel's villainy. And in the 70s, 80s, 60s, we have to remember, what is the way in which Israel looks at itself? Rightly so, it looks at itself as we are a powerful country, and to hell with what anybody else thinks about us. We just don't care. And that was kind of the official Israeli point of view through the 70s and 80s, and even the 90s. And the Intifada that started in the 80s kind of changed the view of Israel in the Western world. They were now considered the persecutors. So when the Intifada, the rising up the West Bank and Gaza, started in the 80s, all of a sudden, anti-Semites had a real foothold, because you see nonstop spewing about how terrible Israel is towards the Gaza people and the West Bank people. You're hearing it from every Muslim country. All of a sudden, people in Europe who don't like Jews start taking hold of it. This is something I can use publicly. And this is what we see today. In the 90s, Israel starts to try and get on the bandwagon of promoting itself better, but it's really hard to do when you have all of these other countries in Europe, in the Middle East, that are saying the same thing, how Israel is the worst country on earth. And especially after South Africa has their unofficial revolution and elects Nelson Mandela, the world needs a new scapegoat. They need a new criminal. And Israel really takes hold, so much so that South Africa now lambashes Israel, forgetting that Israel was one of the few countries that supported it. And so this idea that Israel's persecuting the Muslims, especially the Palestinians, really took hold. And the Palestinians really took hold of this persecuted status using the UN as their ticket. And the leaders in these countries really never wanted to create a country. They just wanted to be anti-Semitic and anti-Israel. And the money just kept streaming in. And this persecution, they learned the tricks. Speak in English. show everything, make sure to only show what the Israelis do and not what they do. Make sure that the only media that can come into the West Bank and the Gaza Strip talk negatively about Israel. That was one of the major brilliant strategies. If you're going to say something negative about the Palestinians in the West Bank or Gaza, you will not have access to us. If you want reporters to come to the West Bank or Gaza Strip, you better be saying what we want you to say. And reporters in the 90s and 80s and 2000s, really before the internet, desperately needed access. And I think one of the most famous examples, I don't know if you ever saw when I forgot the martyr, they had a major martyr, I guess look up all this information, as they're going through the streets, the caskets, and this guy who died, and they accidentally dropped the caskets. And the man who was in the casket gets up and runs away because he was still alive. And when that was shown on a news outlet in Europe, they went to that news organization and says, if you show this anymore, if anybody shows this video, we will not give you access at all. And that video was never shown again. And because these Muslim countries persecuted their own kids, their own people, as a way to scapegoat, they blamed Israel for everything. And it just kept escalating the amount of this propaganda. And so when you get to the age of the internet, you have billions of people spouting this propaganda that's been going on for years. It's like a tidal wave or the dominoes, and it just keeps going. And so no matter what the Palestinians do, Israel is the bad guy. Even though Israel is very reticent to attack unless they are attacked first. But we see this never makes the headlines. The only thing that makes the headlines is when Israel does something wrong. And this is what we're seeing throughout America today. It really takes hold, but it doesn't come to the forefront to the level we see until October 7th. And what we're seeing is how the news can skew anything. I just was at events we had at the synagogue with the CEO of the Georgia Hillels, and it was a very good example. There was I think it was university, I think it was Columbia University, where the police went into the encampments and were beating up people, and you saw them beating up this professor. They had her in cuffs, and that's all you saw in the news. And the same thing happened everywhere. You didn't see that the university police went for hours to these people and said, you need to leave. You're doing this illegally. This is against school policy. If you don't leave, the police are going to come. You didn't see them antagonizing the police. You only see the police cuffing these kids. The college professor who was cuffed and goes online, you don't see her coming and hitting a police officer and screaming at him, and then the police officer cuffs her. You don't see that part of it. You only see the anti-Israel part. And what you see is that this new anti-Semitism is very organized and very knowledgeable about the wording they use. You never see them saying anything anti-Jewish. You don't see them saying we hate Jews. You see them saying anti-Israel. You see them saying river to the sea. You see them antagonizing Jewish kids, but never saying what they're doing. You see them working with the universities. You see the universities hiring for decades anti-Semitic professors because of all this money coming in from the Middle East. And this is where we are today, where it's probably the worst it's been since World War II in many respects. Now, that doesn't mean everybody's against us by any stretch of the imagination. That Jews are still supported in America wholeheartedly. But what you're seeing is a coordinated effort that you didn't see before. What started out as just all of this anti-Semitic rhetoric coming out from different places, you see now has become so much more organized. You see these instigators going from campus to campus using these kids and making sure these kids have very little information, finding students that don't have connections, making sure that whenever anything, they film things from their perspective, working with universities, making sure universities break their own rules in support of this. You can say from river to sea, but you can't say anything negative about anybody else. If you can't say anything negative about Christians or gays or African Americans or women, but you can say it about Jews, as long as you use it through the anti-Israel perspective. And the Jewish community is not very good at protesting for ourselves or standing up for ourselves because we haven't needed to do so. And so what you're seeing is these college kids who are Jewish just don't understand how to do it. And this happens so quickly, this anti-Israel rhetoric that really was promoted by college campuses in many respects. Now, in some places, they did a great job, but in other places, they did a really poor job. You got to remember, all these campuses using tents and encampments is not allowed on any U.S. campus. It's not allowed, but they allowed them to do it. And once they allow them to do it, then when they realize they have to get them off campus, you just see all these arrests. And whenever they make arrests, we know a high percentage are not college students. We also see these tents coming from everywhere, money's filtering in. And again, it's a way of scapegoating Israel. And what we see with the Palestinians is this is how they want it. The Palestinians have no incentive to create their own countries. They get so much money and so much support. There's so much money going through Hamas and Fatah that there's no reason. If they start countries, they're going to lose power. They're afraid that their people may speak out, that their people will have jobs, and that will create havoc for them. As we mentioned, the UN has 2 refugee organizations, one for the world and one for the Palestinians. A refugee, according to the UN, is somebody who's been kicked out of their country and doesn't have a place to live for 5 years, except if you're a Palestinian, you are a lifelong refugee. More money going to I believe there's more money going to the Palestinian refugees than all the rest of the world. That could be wrong, though. Conferences on humanitarian aid to the world have become purely anti-Israel conferences. The UN ambassadors, they just don't go to these conferences anymore because the humanitarian aid conferences on the UN are all about the Palestinians and how terrible Israel is. And so what started out as a difficulty in finding the new anti-Semitism has really culminated in what we see today. Now, is Israel a country that always makes good decisions? Absolutely not. Does the Jewish community support the war? Probably yes, but do we support every action in Gaza? Obviously not. Would we have voted for the prime minister? Obviously not all of us would have. That's the good thing because Israel is a democracy. But that's not getting across. It's the only democracy in the world that gets this kind of negative attention. And what we have to see is countries are allowing it to happen to a degree. And what do I mean to a degree? Europe, America, the rest of the world is very happy to let Israel be bashed up until Iran enters the fray or the Houthis enter the fray, up until instability will be created. So these countries' leaders know that Iran and the Houthis and Iran's terrorism is the biggest threat to the world in many respects, after probably Russia. And so when Iran fires missiles or the Houthis fire missiles, the US is quick to intervene. So is Europe, so is Saudi Arabia, for that matter, or Jordan, because they know what the real problem is. But up until this point, they're happy to let Israel be bashed in many respects. Now, in our country, it's a little different because not every, a lot of people, we have very strong support for Israel in many sects, but in some places we don't. And we see that in the parties. Democratic parties having a lot of issues with anti-Israel hate speech. And I'm not trying to be anti-Democratic Party. We've seen that in the Republican Party before, but right now we're seeing a lot more of it. Ron.
Yeah, the point you just brought out, it's very obvious in the current upcoming elections. We thought that Shapiro from Pennsylvania would be Harris's pick. And then, of course, Arlie and I said, well, he probably won't be picked because he's Jewish.
And that's a good question. I'm sorry,
yeah.
I'm sorry, Ron. I thought you keep going, Ron. I'm sorry, I thought you finished. Well, that's a good point. Now, I'm hesitant to agree with you on that point. Josh Shapiro was probably the second choice. And my wife actually likes, for instance, and some others may like the other candidate a little bit better. So was it because he was Jewish? I'm not so sure. Maybe that was part of it. Kamala Harris's husband is Jewish, but I'm not so sure that kind of anti-Semitism has reached that level of the Democratic Party. Hopefully not, and hopefully that was not the reason. You did see some of that online, but the mere fact that he got to be the finals, and I think going in, he was probably the second choice for a lot of people. I think they wanted somebody who was like a regular Joe, like a nice person from a Midwestern states.
They needed those
So-
Republicans they needed to try to grab the Republicans from the rural area.
Maybe. So I don't know, Ron, if that's the case. I hope not. I don't think so. I think what we're seeing is at the different levels, like with the younger people, which is scary for the future. And so what we're seeing now is that more groups are trying to come together. Now, we also see anti-Semitism on the Republican side as well. You see a lot of those hate groups. So it's on both sides. But the anti-Israel anti-Semitism is really coming, I think, from more one side than the other. And what's important is that we make sure in both parties that we make sure that kind of nonsense is not allowed. If you are upset at Israel because the way they're pursuing the Gaza war, that is really, I think, important for the President of the United States to be able to say that. I think our president has to be critical of everybody. And so does our government. But we have to also teach the difference between legitimate criticism, and I'm going to have a whole holiday sermon on this, and anti-Semitism. And there's a line that sometimes is a balance, and we can see it go. It's, you can see it go one way or the other. So I don't. If it's a I'm not sure, then I give the benefit of the doubts. Why not? But we're seeing like these protests. It is not. Most of them are not even close. They're completely anti-Semitic in what they're doing. And we're seeing it not only from the students, which is what we saw in the 60s, but from professors, which is even scarier. The professors are protesting their own schools alongside their students. That's a little scary. And what we're also seeing is a very big difference between these protests and the protests in the 60s. And what's the big difference? Well, there's a lot of differences. I apologize. The protests in the 60s were, let's stop our government from doing something. Let's stop our government from sending people abroad. Although some of the protests today are, let's stop America supporting Israel financially, most of them are just anti-Israel, as if America makes decisions for Israel. I mean, these protests make no sense because they're not trying to change policy. They're trying to change attitude. They're just hate speeches. They're, let's kill all these people. Let's destroy this country. We protest genocide by promoting genocide. So there are so many ironies in this protest. And what we're seeing is a lot of support for the Jewish community, though. And that's what I think we want to spend the last 15 minutes on. For all the anti-Semitism through this anti-Israel protest movement, we're seeing a lot of support for Jews in Israel. So even though this anti-Semitism has become mainstream, it has not become the majority view. Most Americans still support the Jewish community. Most still support Israel, even if they're critical. Most Jews feel very comfortable in either of the major parties. We're seeing a lot of support in the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. President of the United States' husband is Jewish, and she doesn't hide it. The former president's daughter is Jewish and son-in-law is Jewish, and he doesn't hide it. Neither president or neither major party has shown any support for anti-Semitism. There's been some anti-Israel supports, but it's not coming from the major players in either party. Certainly you see some Congress people and some senators, but it's not the power brokers yet. And that's really important. You see these campus students who were protesting, but we're not talking about hundreds of thousands of people. We're talking in some cases, hundreds of people. In some cases, maybe a few thousand, which is still a very small percentage. But unfortunately, it makes the headlines, especially because it's coming on campuses which are considered in many respects, most prestigious campuses in the country. And so what we're seeing is a lot of pushback on these campuses, thank goodness, for the anti-Semitic policies they've had and the anti-Israel, masking it as anti-Israel. But unfortunately, you see a lot of students. And so the fear is not as much today as for when these students in 20 years are the power brokers. That's the biggest concern. So for us, it's a lot about getting the correct information out there, teaching about what is real critical criticism versus anti-Semitism. It's not about encouraging students not to protest. We want to encourage them to protest. That's their God-given right. We know what would happen if they protested in the countries they're supporting, by the way. But we're seeing the ironies of all of these college kids holding up pictures of Hamas leaders and supporting them, of cheers when Iran shoots missiles at Israel. So this is where we have to really stand up. And again, the biggest difference is the Jewish community has a lot more respect and a lot more say. This is still a very democratic government. We have not seen the very quick, we think a lot of people refer to Nazi Germany. In Nazi Germany, there was a very quick handover of power, a very quick taking of power. And so it's our duty to ensure that that doesn't happen here. So whenever we see political systems breaking down, that we have to rev up the political system, even if we don't like a candidate. Any candidate who wants to tear down our political system in any way is a bad candidate on both sides. And so it's for us to ensure that if we don't like a candidate, that candidate can be voted out. That whenever we see this anti-Semitic rhetoric, we see people coming in and saying that is not right. We work with the police. We've seen a very welcoming, incredible support from the police officers around the country. They have been very ardent in trying to keep these protests from spiraling. You've seen governors come out. I'll give an example, and I don't like to be political, but the governor of Georgia come out, and we've seen laws passed in states redefining what anti-Semitism is, using river to the sea as a wording that's not allowed. We see that in Germany. saying river to the sea is illegal because it's considered genocidal. We see leaders of European countries where anti-Semitism is much worse than here, supporting Jewish communities as well. So when we think the world is ending, it is far from that. Are these protests a threat? Absolutely. But are they destroying the world? No. And that's something for us to remember. We have to keep fighting and supporting true criticism while denouncing anti-Semitism. And that's a very important thing for us to do when they show, when, the ironies, and we'll talk about this in my sermon, I mean, the ironies, the gay rights movement supporting Hamas. I mean, that is just women's group supporting Hamas. I mean, can you get anything more ridiculous than that? College campuses filled with women and gay rights supporters. I remember there are all these videos showing how Palestinians have gay right movements and we should support Hamas. And of course, if you go to those websites, where are all those Palestinian gay rights movements? They're in Israel. They're not in Palestinian territories, they're in Israel. It's really easy to ignore the truth when you have been pressured and when all of this negative press becomes overwhelming. So we have two sides to the coin here. We'll see if the protest movement continues. I think it probably will. There's too much money going in and it's too organized to stop. Well, hopefully the students will wake up and hopefully the college campuses will. We saw what happened with MIT, Harvard, and Penn, and they went before Congress. And hopefully these things can change, but we'll see. We're also seeing a very quick lowering of the numbers at these major campuses of Jewish students. And this is before the protests. The number of Jewish students at Ivy League colleges has dropped by more than half in just a few years.
Is
And
that
I
because
think
fewer are applying or they're getting turned down?
that is a big question I don't have the answer for. I mean, you see it both ways, obviously. Possibly these campuses are looking for other things. Maybe more Jews are going to other campuses because it's less expensive. Certainly I know Jewish students in Georgia, as other students have gotten into MIT and have decided to go to Georgia Tech. That definitely happens a lot because obviously Georgia Tech would be almost free for a lot of these students. But I think we're seeing a little bit of both. I think we're also seeing possibly some campus. It's not official, but certainly that perhaps some kids are not getting in for those reasons. And it's not all campuses, but certainly Ivies. And you can go online to get the actual statistics because I don't know them right now. And if I do, I don't want to say because I could be wrong. But I think it's something we have to look at. And then I think we have to remember that, especially in the South, we're seeing very little of this anti-Semitism that we hear of, possibly because there's not as many Jews in the South. And we certainly see it on some campuses. We've had some problems at Georgia Tech and Georgia, even at Emory, and some Florida schools, some Texas schools, but it's not to the degree, I think, of other places. And there are also litigation out there and there's other things. I wish I had videoed the CEO Hillel speaking because he brought up a lot of interesting facts about what's going on behind the scenes. Some things are better than we thought, some things are worse. But I think the answer is today, anti-Israel is the new anti-Semitism.
And
A lot of
also,
it. I'm sorry, go ahead, Genevieve.
I was just gonna say a lot of it, unfortunately, is my kids' generation. They're so more online than I guess we are as adults.
Yeah.
And that's what I started to notice that worried me, and why I started talking out more was because I noticed all my kids' friends we're so tapped into like the drama, but there's so much online, and there was so much propaganda online, but we weren't really fighting it because we weren't in that world, if that makes sense. And then so I was trying to figure out how to get to my kids' generation in their world because they were so like plugged in. And it was just there wasn't a balance. It was just all negative, not all negative, but a lot of it. Anybody who tried to speak out positive would get attacked by like a million people.
Right. Well, and I think that's something we have to remember. We're still a very small minority, but that also, what we have to do is make sure our students and we understand that, we can be powerful. There's a lot of support also. And so I know Jewish students who've been walking with their friends, they come upon these protests and all of their friends galvanize and walk next to them and help them, So it's important for us to remember that we have to get the word out as much as possible and make sure our students feel comfortable supporting Israel, being Jewish on campus, and don't feel like they have to hide it. And that's really difficult because, again, these are 18-year-old kids coming from often very nice, supportive atmospheres. We saw none of these issues at their high schools, and all of a sudden, they're alone on these big campuses, and they see protesters, even see Jews joining in. And so it has a lot to do with us educating them more and doing a better job. So any thoughts next week? We are going to get to my calendar. There's one week
Probably
I think I
have-
went.
You probably
I'm
have
sorry, Genevieve?
generations. And you guys can tell me more, but it seems like there's generations in the Jewish community too that are used to like hiding or walking the line or like watching what you say to protect your family. And so maybe that's a little bit ingrained in the culture too.
Absolutely, and that's definitely one of the things we have to worry about, is that we have to teach. So we'll talk about that next week. Next week, we're going to talk about the Dreyfus affair. We're going to do it at Ron and Arlene's house because we know how, I think Ron's a descendant from Dreyfus, so his great-great-grandfather. And so Ron has a lot of memorabilia that he'll be donating to the synagogue. I thank you for that, Ron.
Yeah, Rabbi, you're going to put an email out to everybody, right? For next
Right. I'll put. Do you want me to put? I'm just putting it up to this group, but do you want to put it to other people as well? It's going out on our email to call us.
Okay.
It should already going out on our emails, but I'll send a special note to the people who have been coming. Can I send the address?
Because I think David is coming in from England.
Oh,
I'd
great.
love to. If I had
I
had
hope
them
so.
a bit more notice, but there will be a Zoom connection.
Yeah, there'll be Zoom. And so probably tomorrow, Friday, I'll send out Ron's address to everybody who's on this email list. Because we don't want to send out the address to everybody, obviously. And then anybody else who's interested on the email will say, I think, give us a call and we'll give the address. So, and then we'll ask people to register so that people who are not in Sun City can be given passes.
Rabbi, like I said to you last Saturday, the last few weeks of this session has been so wonderful. It
Thank
really
you, Ron. I appreciate it.
excellent.
And I hope and I'm looking forward to next week because the Dreyfus affair really is something that we forget about all the time. And when we do talk about it, it's almost exclusively spoken about in its connection with the founding of the state of Israel. I mean, it is. Oh, Ron, go ahead.
Yeah, Ollie and I went to a service in Charleston. And who came over to introduce themselves? A woman who's from the Dreyfus family.
Yeah, we met her.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow, that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
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 They were very nice people too, because we just walked in, and they were
That's
very
great.
outgoing, nice people.
Yeah.
You mean Todd didn't bring Richard Dreyfuss to the synagogue when he
Yeah.
was here in Savannah filming?
Oh man, he should have done that too, because Richard Dreyfuss is a nice Jewish boy.
Oh, by the way, this Friday, I'm so happy to say that I will reach 92.
Oh my God.
Happy
Awesome stuff.
birthday, Ron.
You look great.
That is a real celebration.
Doing great.
So should I bring a birthday cake on for Wednesday? Or I can order one.
No, no.
That's right.
All right, but anybody who's coming next Wednesday, please bring food, and then I will bring a birthday cake, or I will. So I just gotta, if I can remember, I'm gonna email myself. Do you want me to put the age on there, Ron, or just
You know what?
happy birthday?
I am so happy to reach that age. It doesn't bother me at all.
If you bring a cake, it has to have 92 candles on it.
Yeah, right,
That's right.
right.
The fire marshal will
I
be.
don't, even though I have good lungs, I don't know if I have that much capacity to blow out 92 candles.
But that's okay. But as I said, I was about to mention, the fire marshal in Bluffton is Jewish, so we're all good. He's going to be there. Happy birthday. And again,
you.
we have this Friday services are off site. They're going to be on Tybee. And then any other things coming up? Also, the welcome back party for anybody who wants to come will be on August 18th. It's for adults and kids. All right. Stay
Okay.
safe, everybody, and stay
Take
dry.
care, everybody.
Bye now.
Thanks,
Thank
Rabbi.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Happy birthday, Ron.